The year was 1937. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just begun settling down into his second term as President of the United States of America. With the Great Depression having already reached its nadir and Prohibition long since come and gone, the people were tired, hungry, and sick. Championing his New Deal, Roosevelt promised a better future for his fellow Americans and undertook one of the largest welfare programs in American history. Many of these programs focused on creating new federal agencies or strengthening existing ones. Of these, the existing Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration, today simply known as the FDA, was not a priority. Roosevelt enacted primarily programs and policies during this time that focused on economic revitalization, not regulation. Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, cousin of FDR, created the FDA in 1906, and it remained unchanged in authoritative power for the first 3 decades of its existence. It would take a tragedy and a loophole for this to change. As explained through medicine, interviews, and congressional records, the Elixir sulfanilamide crisis of 1937 exposed the budding FDA's weaknesses and allowed it to exploit regulatory loopholes to remedy the situation, and eventually expand its mandate. The story of Elixir sulfanilamide began in Europe. In Germany, in early 1931, one of the chemists working for a large dye factory noticed that a new dye stained only harmful bacteria, which could give it medical applications. Gerhard Domack, one of the factory's researchers, would take this dye, which stained the Streptococcus bacterium a bright red, and linked it with a recently developed antibiotic. Thus Protonsil, the first sulfonamide, was born, and the discovery was published in 1935. This predecessor of sulfanilamide is probably most well known in America for 2 presidents' sons making full recoveries from an infection through treatment with this drug. Later experiments based on Protonsil's original research proved that not only was pure sulfanilamide just as effective as its predecessor Protonsil, but it was also capable of killing bacteria that were responsible for diseases such as pneumonia, gonorrhea, and dysentery. If the likes of Time magazine claimed that pure sulfanilamide was effective and lauded it as the medical discovery of the decade, where did Elixir sulfanilamide go wrong? The problem lies with production. The Samuel Evans Massengill Company, based out of Bristol, Tennessee, had been producing the medicine component sulfanilamide since late 1935, before the elixir was developed, in the form of capsules and tablets. The company advertised sulfanilamide as the treatment for all conditions in which the hemolytic streptococci appear. The sales team for Dr. S.E. Massengill's company approached its chief chemist, Mr. Harold Watkins, and mentioned that there was a distinct interest in a liquid suspension of the streptococcal treatment. Sulfanilamide was newer to the United States than of Europe, and there were no easy recipes on how to distribute the medicine in a liquid form. Dr. Morris Fishbein of the American Medical Association recalled in an interview some of the problems with finding a formulation. Quote, "If you put in liquids, what kind of liquids do you put it in? If you put it in spirits, spiritus fermenti, or peppermint water? Do you put it in an elixir which is sweet and gooey? How do you put it up?" End quote. Mr. Watkins was undeterred. He soon discovered, after some trial and error, that sulfanilamide cannot be dissolved in the more common water-based solvents that were available at his and other local pharmaceutical companies. Eventually, Mr. Watkins found what he thought was a suitable replacement, propylene glycol. However, Mr. Watkins ended up using a different glycol altogether. This replacement proved to be extremely efficient. When mixed, diethylene glycol could dissolve as much as 75 grams of sulfanilamide per 1 fluid ounce. To make the compounded solution less bitter, he added a pint of raspberry extract to every 60 gallons of diethylene glycol. In the report to Congress by then-incumbent Secretary of Agriculture, Henry A. Wallace, other ingredients included in Mr. Watkins' recipe were saccharin, elixir flavoring, caramel, amaranth solution, and water quantum satis. With this discovery, they had found a solution to a problem that not many may have realized. Those who could not swallow capsules or tablets easily now had a new option for antibiotics. In fact, an October brochure from the company marketed that quality. Quote, "Our research department has just released an elixir sulfanilamide, 40 grams to the fluid ounce. It is ideal for your patients who can take liquids, but little else. Also, it is not unpleasant to take, so it is suitable for children." End quote. This alludes to the raspberry extract, which, as the report would later state, also dyed the concoction a bright red. Although not entirely marketed towards children, it is not outrageous to claim that children would be a major section of consumers using the product, given its effectiveness treating common childhood illnesses such as strep throat, and the fruitful flavoring to dampen the bitterness of the medicine. Unfortunately, this product would turn out to be unfit for consumption. Given the relative newness of this drug, the side effects of this elixir were not that well known. Antibiotics that contain sulfanilamide are a class of drug often referred to as sulfonamide drugs, and considering the chemical makeup of sulfanilamide has remained mostly unchanged, the general side effects have also generally remained the same as they would have in 1937. According to the National Institute of Health, common side effects for sulfonamide drugs include, quote, nausea, diarrhea, skin rash, headaches, and dizziness, end quote. Regardless of the side effects of sulfanilamide, diethylene glycol is not fit for human consumption. Once ingested, symptoms of diethylene glycol poisoning last anywhere from 7 days to 3 whole weeks. These include, as noted in fatality reports to Congress after the fact, quote, stoppage of urine, severe abdominal pain, nausea and vomiting, stupor, convulsions preceded death in some cases, end quote. This is well documented in 2023, but 100 years ago, the science was still developing, and there was no foresight. By October 1937, S.E. Massengill had developed 200 gallons of elixir sulfanilamide. In addition, the company had produced a control batch of 40 gallons to ensure taste and quality standards. The company began shipping the drug, reaching from the shores of San Francisco to the ports of New York City. These shipments varied in size, from pints to gallons, and some even included 1-ounce vials dedicated for samples to doctors, chemists, and pharmacists. Hundreds of miles away from Tennessee, tragedy struck fast. The first report came from a physician to the FDA on October 14th, where concerns about manufacture errors arose. By the end of the month, reports were coming into the AMA of deaths in Tulsa, Oklahoma. On October 23rd, the Journal of the American Medical Association claimed that 9 out of 10 patients who were prescribed elixir sulfanilamide were dead. Given the circumstances, conclusions about the primary poisoning agent were unclear, but it was evident that there was a large amount of diethylene glycol in the product. Cases varied in dosage, with some children being asymptomatic after drinking almost 8 fluid ounces, but other children, including newborns, dying after ingesting less than 2 fluid ounces. A week later, the Journal of the AMA reported that the death toll had risen to 46, and death was no longer contained to Tulsa. The AMA called on all physicians to submit any known cases of this poisoning and related deaths. By November 6th, the death toll was 60. Members of the AMA lamented the fact that the FDA could do nothing to force the hands of S.E. Massengill to release their proprietary formula. In fact, Massengill's response was thus, quote, "We regret exceedingly this unfortunate occurrence, but as we violated no law and made no error in our manufacture, I do not think we should be blamed by the unlooked-for action of this product." End quote. Calls for action became louder, but the hands of the FDA were tied, as there was only certain stipulations that could cause a recall. At this point, a letter made its way to President Roosevelt's desk, in which Mays Nidifer commented on the loss of her daughter, Joan Marler, one of the original deaths in Tulsa. Quote, "Tonight our little home is bleak and full of despair. All that is left to us is the caring for that little grave. Even the memory of her is mixed with sorrow, for we can see her little body tossing to and fro and hear that little voice screaming with pain, and it seems as though it would drive me insane. During her 9 days of illness, as we sat by her bed, only once did those little eyes lose their dull and unknowing look. Jean and I begged her to look and know us. A smile broke over her face, and she laughed aloud with us, and as quickly it vanished, never to smile and know us again." End quote. She was sure it was Elixir sulfanilamide that killed her daughter. After a total of 4 weeks, 353 people had taken Elixir sulfanilamide, prescribed by physicians they trusted. Of these, 105 died. 34 deaths were those of children. Only 6 out of the 240 produced gallons had been consumed. By early December, news had reached even the shores of the United Kingdom, where the British Medical Journal warned of dangers of unregulated drugs. In the United States, the sentiment was nearly the same. This tragedy was avoidable. Looking at the event in retrospect obviously raises questions. Why did this last 4 weeks? Why was the drug even allowed on the market? Why did 105 people have to die before this could be fully stopped? The simplest answer is that the FDA could not react as strongly as it wanted to. As hinted at previously, the governing body had little reform since the first major act passed that gave it power. The regulations and authoritative power of the original FDA were primarily based on the events that led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Although this event, the story of Harvey Wiley's Poison Squad, is incredible, and the resulting Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was beneficial, it did not account for every avenue of drug production. Contradictorily, many thought the law was too good to be altered, with Wiley himself calling it nothing short of perfect. A retrospective in 1917 by the chief chemist of the U.S. Bureau of Chemistry on 10 years of the law made similar claims on the remarkable success of the act, but also offered an analytical review. There were striking weaknesses within the law that were noticed even 10 years before the tragedy. In what can be described as foreshadowing, the report states on the limitations of the law, quote, "Especially conspicuous are the lack of legal standards for foods, of authority to inspect warehouses, and of any restriction whatever upon the use of many of the most virulent poisons and drugs. The limitations placed upon the term drug by definition, which render it difficult to control injurious cosmetics." End quote. Other comments made by the chief chemist were that there were no viable regulation of adulterated food and drugs, and severe limitations on stopping the spread of such food and drugs. Although the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration was the specific governing body that was created to oversee the situation, its own creation was its restriction. While the FDA was limited in 1937, it did try to react when it received news of the deaths. Although, like previously mentioned, it could not have stopped the manufacturing process, investigated any warehouses, or restricted further batches, it could have stopped shipments already in progress. After learning that Elixir sulfanilamide was the product of a Tennessee company, they rushed to S.E. Massengill and started to track shipments. Every agent at one point was mobilized somewhere in the country trying to track down these shipments. One FDA agent, Clarence Schiffman, in an interview with historian James H. Young, even remembered the event kind-heartedly, stating, quote, "We were all sent out, most of the force, and I had occasion to go chase around in the mountains of Georgia. That's a good story." End quote. Schiffman was tasked with retrieving any possible bottle they could find. He mentions that, quote, "One of the hardest ones was a little kid that I finally got up to after my car got stuck and I climbed the mountain by foot and managed to get to the little cabin where they told me the child was. I found then the bottle of Elixir sulfanilamide, either half full or half empty," end quote. Fortunately, the child was fine, as he luckily forgot to take the medicine to a relative's house he had just returned from. Schiffman and peers across the country conducted a coast-to-coast operation to seize shipments over October and November, and fortunately, every bottle and vial of the medicine was retrieved, according to the report to Congress. If the FDA had little power to stop the distribution, how did it manage to seize all the elixir? Miraculously, it all came down to labels and loopholes. Although it may seem disheartening, Massengill's response was factually correct. Under the terms of the Pure Food and Drug Act, they did almost everything right. There were no regulations regarding testing for the safety of a food or drug product before sending it to market. The medicine itself could not have been subject of prosecution by law. However, the drug was not an elixir according to the law. An elixir was a medicine dissolved in ethanol, but Elixir sulfanilamide was dissolved in diethylene glycol. If the diethylene glycol were disclosed on the bottle and the medicine was given another name, the FDA could have done nothing to stop the tragedy at all. With the deaths of Americans piling up, Congress eventually acted. With consistent yelling from all sides of the aisle for more regulation, Congress first demanded a report of the tragedy, which Secretary of Agriculture H.A. Wallace provided. The report contained everything: the recipe, method of production, tracking of shipments, advertisements, communications, symptoms, and even potential action under existing law. With this documentation, they could devise a new act that would add more regulations to existing ones and prevent a tragedy of this scope from reoccurring. FDA Chief W.G. Campbell used this idea of progress from tragedy to comfort Ms. Nidifer in an official response to her letter. Quote, "I agree with you that it should not have been necessary for your baby to die to arouse public sentiment to the point that proper legislation will be enacted. If it is enacted, and I sincerely believe that there are strong and good men in both the House and Senate who have resolved that laws will be passed that will make a repetition of this tragedy impossible, it may be some small comfort to you to know that your letter had a real influence in bringing about this result." End quote. Draft a law they did. In 1938, a year after the disaster, Congress passed the Pure Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This act addressed the weaknesses that many had cited and added a few new provisions. Some of these included the provisions that tolerances were set for toxic substances, especially those that could not be avoided, rigorous standards of identity, quality, and measurement of foods and drugs, authorization for factory inspections, and court actions, including injunctions, that were done in addition to the previous penalties of material seizure. The law also provided room for amendments that altered or added restrictions as need be. This was indeed fruitful, as many amendments have been added over the years, including poultry amendments, pesticide amendments, modernization amendments, and even a Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Samuel Evans Massengill and Company got off easy, unfortunately. Because the laws were passed after the tragedy, little could be done to hold the company accountable for their crimes. The most they could be fined was $26,000 for misbranding. This was in addition to $148,000 in damage claims. The lives of over 100 people amounted to less than $200,000, according to S.E. Massengill and the U.S. government. Sam Massengill got off better overall. In fact, as he eventually became president of the Bristol Chamber of Commerce and would sell the company to the tune of $54 million. Harold Watkins, his chief chemist, would commit suicide a week after Massengill's election while awaiting trial. This tragedy and the resulting legal reforms forever changed the landscape of American government. Before the tragedy, the Food and Drug Administration was just a small office of the American executive. The quick thinking and perseverance of an agency that could only do so much brought it into the spotlight and put it on the map as a powerful governing body. The Pure Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act remains the overarching guidelines for the FDA. The law still works even today, where the FDA played a significant role in containing the SARS-CoV-2 virus in the resulting COVID-19 pandemic only 3 years ago. The regulations found in this act and other amendments allowed emergency authorizations that sped up the mass production of viable vaccines. Without these provisions, the pandemic would have gone unchecked.